Yes, I'm for compensation for the victims, ancestors of this riot, mainly because I think our ancestors fought long and hard for what they had, to be taken away from them because of color. I, I, I just feel like in some form of fashion, they should compensate. You go to Wilmington, all the areas downtown Wilmington, near the battleship, all of those streets around that property. That is land that at some point in time, Thomas Miller had a portion of that land. He owned quite a bit of that land around there. And for me to be a descendant of him, I look at it, I go there, I see all the condos being built, I see all of the development in the area, and just think, part of that should be ours. If we were like stripped of our rights to a lot of his things because of color.
I'm going to war, find my brother. I'm going to war, find my brother. I'm one of the regular people, guy. Why we ain't got no voice? It said to me, shall inherit the earth, pimp. Listen, I was born in a city, a small little city with limited options. So now I'm torn between lyrics and what Diddy would sponsor. From feeling like a pig in a forest to being chased by pigs in a Taurus to getting big in a fortress. You say you fresh to death, you're meant in a coffin. Plus if you're important, you can get it imported. They say I look like a dude that was given a fortune, but I move like a genius that lived as an orphan. Shouty say when I hit it, I hit kidneys and organs. Hey, don't cue that fat lady pimp and give me some organs. That's that American pie, I'ma give me your portion. So if you care to reply, I'ma go Christopher Wallace and bury you guys with the same thing Biggie was talking.
Hey, look.
You let me. You guys are done now, right?
We're doing the last little tiny clip right now. Well, I first started hearing about 1898 in 1968 when Dr. King was murdered. There were riots in Wilmington, as there were all over the country. At the time, my family was deeply involved with First Baptist Church. And immediately adjacent to the church was the Wilmington Light Infantry building, which at the time was the New Hanover County Library. But the Wilmington Light Infantry still maintained a room in that building. And in that room was the guns they used in 1898, including the machine gun, which I used to play with when I was a kid. When I'd go to the library, and there would be members of the Wilmington Light Infantry in that room or Red Shirt Militia in that room, I would go in there and listen to them talk about 1898 and how they had pulled off the coup and how they had killed hundreds and hundreds of people and how, they had taken over. The words they used was, we put them niggers in their place.
People here, they wouldn't talk about it. It's almost like post-traumatic stress or denial. No one really would talk about it. And I had an older cousin. She wouldn't talk about it. Only thing she would say was that it was not about what's been written.
What really brought 1898 out was the Wilmington 10. I don't think if it hadn't been for the Wilmington 10, it would have still been a secret. Because in researching the Wilmington 10, you bump into 1898. You have to bump into 1890. It was the civil rights issue after the assassination of Martin Luther King. Of course, after the assassination of when Martin Luther King was killed in April of 1968, there was racial violence and burning and looting rioting in over 100 cities. So when this Wilmington 10 thing came up, it was a big deal. There were high school students who were boycotting the school because they had closed down the black high school in Wilmington. And what happened was they started meeting at this church, and the Ku Klux Klan came by the church, shooting at the church, at the children who were inside. These were children inside the church, and most of them left after that. Right? It was 4 days of racial violence. 2 people were killed, almost $1 million worth of damage, if you count today's money, right? But what they didn't count on was arresting Ben Chavis, who was highly intelligent, who had connections. And he started alerting all these people about what had been done. They arrested, a year after 1971, 1972, they arrested some people who later became known as the Wilmington 10. In the process, you had to look at the history of Wilmington. And when you looked at the history of Wilmington, you found out that the town is almost synonymous with racial violence.
Wilmington was what the New South could have become after the Civil War. Everybody, regardless of race and class, was making it financially. It was the day wages for everyone working in the community was higher than anywhere else in the state. African Americans had businesses from real estate through to attorneys and teachers, and every level of society was prospering for African Americans in Wilmington.
It was a very prosperous city. It was the largest city in North Carolina. It had a population in which the blacks outnumbered the whites. It was thriving commerce at the seaport. Their literacy rate had increased unbelievably high since the emancipation at the end of the Civil War. They had tradesmen in every trade you can think of. There barbers. Almost all the eating places were owned by blacks. There were blacks who were on the police force, fire department. They were just part of a real community.
By the 1890s, you had, 4 lawyers in Wilmington. You had a black doctor in Wilmington. And I cite in my book, it was called a Mecca. There were advertisements in newspapers stating, come to Wilmington, there are good jobs here. And you have to also remember that Wilmington was a port, a very important port. So anytime you have a port city, there's always a way for them to strive and survive, and prosper.
I know that the ports were a major industry in Wilmington because sea work was a major industry for our people, even during chattel enslavement. In the Cape Fear River region, those waters and navigating those waters were largely done by who they called Negro seamen. So you have the men passing this tradition down to the other young men in their families. So you had many shrimpers and shrimping companies and fishing companies. You still have some Gullah Geechee owned clam companies that come out of Wilmington. And so that was a big, big industry for our people.
There were a lot of prosperous black people in southeastern North Carolina, and particularly in Wilmington. I mean, if you walk around in 1897 in downtown Wilmington, there would be a white shop and then a black shop, then a white shop, then a black owned shop, then a white owned shop, and then a black owned shop. And they were all business people, and they interacted with each other. And that was business wise. And then socially, they began to interact with each other. And, there began to be interracial marriages and affairs and just natural life. And the racist Democrats just couldn't stand it. I mean, it just went against everything that they had been raised to hate.
Explain the whole white supremacy movement that was going on in the country, especially in the South, around this time.
Well, let's look at the Civil War. Lincoln said that he was there to maintain the Union, and that if he had to free all the blacks, he would. If he could free half of them, he would. If he had to free all of them, he would. So actually, he was concerned about the Union and not about the problems that blacks had. So when the war ended, the South never quit fighting it.
When the Confederacy lost the Civil War to the Union, this ain't talked about a lot. But when they lost, the fury that came out of that loss was fueled by the fact that they lost to black soldiers. Remember, up until blacks enlisting in the Civil War, the Union was losing to the Confederacy. The Mason-Dixon line runs through Pennsylvania. That's how far north the South had pushed. It was blacks who beat the Confederacy, not whites, not Abraham Lincoln. It was blacks who defeated the South. That is what fueled the hatred of the Southern white man for the black man more than it had ever been fueled before. I didn't lose to Abraham Lincoln's army. I lost to my own slaves.
In my research of a lot of these people that were involved in this, when they returned from the Civil War to North Carolina, they got involved in Democratic politics. And because at the time, the Democratic Party was basically pure white. There were no black Democrats in the South.
Because the United States did not pursue a policy that we refer to as lustration, which is the prevention of traitors from continued participation in the political process. I mean, the United States was very gentle in its treatment to the ex-Confederates. And the ex-Confederates were insistent that black political participation would have to be stopped. This included, particularly in South Carolina and Louisiana, the assassination of a number of black elected officials. But in North Carolina, it almost results in the lynching of the white Republican fusion governor. And it does result ultimately in the destruction of the black community in Wilmington, North Carolina.
Professor Helen Edmonds, who was the first black female to get a PhD at Ohio State, her thesis was fusion politics in North Carolina. That was the first person to say, wait a minute, something that happened down in North Carolina was no massacre, no blacks running amok. And she brought in the whole political situation to show that all this stuff revolved around blacks voting.
North Carolina, because of fusion politics, that is the joining of the Republican Party with the with a populist party that consisted of primarily white farmers, while the Republican Party was dominated by the newly freed slaves. The Fusion Party extended its successes in North Carolina politics into the 1890s. And so there was a climate in the state that might have been conducive to greater economic success for blacks, because the political process was one that was more fairly representative and inclusive of a black political presence.
Politically, African Americans held roles in the management of both the city and the county. And we had members in the African American community on the Board of Aldermen, which was the elected body that ran the affairs of the city at the time. They had been serving on the Board of Aldermen from earlier periods all the way through till 1898. And at the state level, we had African Americans serving in the legislature and in the House of Representatives in Washington, D.C. These weren't people from Wilmington, but yet at the same point, African Americans had a voice in politics from the local level all the way up prior to 1898.
One of the things that a lot of people talk about, and Tim Tyson and other people have written this anthology called Democracy Betrayed. And I think it's a good point. I think it was working, this experiment, if you want to call it an experiment, of blacks and whites joining together, voting together as a bloc, putting their people in. It was working. So I think, to answer your question, the blacks, the African Americans in Wilmington, were on a new vista. They say, well, we were freed from slavery. Now we're freedmen. Now we can be a part of this political process. We can be a part of this economic process, and we can be a part of this social process. And that's what you have to have in order to be, I think, in order to be a fulfilled American citizen. You have to feel like you're part of this process. And I think they definitely felt that they were part of the process, just by the mere fact that they had someone that looked like them on the board of aldermen. I think it was great. You know, it was apparently a good time to be alive before November 11, 1898. It's not funny though, is it?
It's the Constitution and bylaws of the White Government Union created in 1897 by the North Carolina Democratic Party. And it's an actual pamphlet that was printed by the Democratic Party in Raleigh, North Carolina. We're going to get a better copy than this because the copier at Latimer House is not the best. But this is what we got for right now. And it's several pages long, and it describes how they're to organize, how they're to report, and how their aim is to install white supremacy government in North Carolina. It even tells them how to organize. The White Government Union was a secret political society that is prohibited by the Constitution of the state of North Carolina. It is much like the Klan, but actually much more organized and much greater secrecy involving the White Government Union. The White Government Union was created by a vote of the North Carolina Executive Committee of the North Carolina Democratic Party in 1897. Wilmington attorney William Barry McCoy was its first executive chairman. And he was also the attorney for New Hanover County. He was like the prosecutor. He was also the chairman of the New Hanover County Board of Elections and a member of the Masons and many other social and political organizations in New Hanover County. He was an attorney who had actually studied law under a Supreme Court justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court. The White Government Union was actually created to organize the Democrats, to terrorize the populists, and to vote Democrat, and to break up the fusionist coalition of the populist and black Republicans so that the Democrats could re-seize political power in North Carolina. And in fact, I've got a copy of their Constitution and bylaws here, and in their preface, they say that's exactly what their intent is to do. There's been a division between the white men. Well, the division was the Democratic Party and the Populist Party. And so the White Government Union was created to break up that fusion of the Populists and Republicans. And it even says so right here in their Constitution and bylaws, that was their intent. The Democratic Party created the White Government Union in 1897. And they had militias like the Wilmington Light Infantry, which were state militias like today's National Guard. And they had them in most of the counties, but they weren't large enough to pull off a coup d'etat. And so basically the members of the militias created a de facto militia called the Red Shirts. The Red Shirts weren't members of the local militias, but they took their orders from them. They were like, the militias were like the officers, and the Red Shirts were the in the trenches troops. They did the dirty work. And so that's what the Red Shirt militia basically was unofficial militia.
They would tell you if you came to vote, they'd kill you. And they would. But their main violence thing was either burn down a black business. If you seem like you're moving too forward economically, then you had to go. So they destroy your business. Or again, back to suffrage, that was the main thing that they did not want black people to get involved into, because they realized the power of the vote. And you risk your life just to go down to vote.
The red shirts were a unique thing to North Carolina in 1898. We had never seen red shirt activity here. They're akin to the Ku Klux Klan in that they use white supremacy and intimidation and violence, but they're different because they wore bright red shirts. They didn't cover their faces, and the things they did were in broad daylight. The red shirts were a new tool of the Democratic Party. And whenever there was a meeting of the white government union, there also happened to be a rally of the red shirts at the same time. So they closely worked hand in hand to make use of the same resources.
I'd also like to say this, too, that when the North Carolina Democratic Party's Executive Committee created the White Government Union in 1897, they did so by a vote. Well, we know that it was created. We have their Constitution and bylaws. It even says within the Constitution and bylaws it was created by the Democratic Party to do this. What I'd like to know is, when was the vote taken to abolish their secret political society? I'd like the North Carolina Democratic Party Executive Committee to answer that question, because I've never heard that it was ever abolished.
So what you're saying is it's probably still going on?
I think it's alive and well in North Carolina.
Tell me a little bit about your grandfather, Alex Manley. What was his background?
Alex Manley, his name was actually Alexander, but everybody called him Alex. He is the acknowledged grandson of the governor of North Carolina, Charles Manley. So he looked more white than black. He went to Hampton, studied painting, actually commercial painting, painting buildings and stuff like that. And apparently he must have taken classes in printing. I've tried to get his papers, well, not tried, I got some of his papers from Hampton, but they're not that extensive. And he came to Wilmington to work, and in my grandmother's letter, his wife, he worked with her father and saw her and was smitten by her, but her family didn't want her to marry him because he was too light. They didn't want to marry somebody that light. He started a paper. It started as a weekly. Became at one time the only daily black paper in the country. And he had good contact with white business people. They advertised in the paper and did very well. What created a problem for him, a lady named Rebecca Latimer Felton, who happened to be the first female U.S. Senator. She became U.S. Senator when Watson, great Klansman here in Atlanta, died, made a speech in Tybee Island, which is a resort outside of Savannah, Georgia, called Women on the Farm. And her speech revolved around the fact that these white women who were working on the farm after the Civil War were out working with blacks, picking cotton or whatever, and they were not protected by their man, and blacks were raping them at will. And her argument was that to protect these pure white women, that if they lynched 1,000 blacks a day, it wouldn't be enough.
So Manley was incensed by that. He wrote an editorial, and within the editorial, he cites the fact that there were white women who were going with black men, willingly, not against the, consensually, and he says it's not a big secret at all, and he talked about the fact that there were white men messing with black women, having sexual relationships with black women, and that's like, that's a boogeyman. You don't cross that line. Makes it look how white he looked. You don't cross that line, because one of the main things that the white man holds in high esteem is his woman. You don't touch them. That they're like forbidden fruit, taboo in 1898. But this stuff has been going on since they got off the boat, man. White men have been having sexual relationships with black women and vice versa. But they use that as an excuse to stir up the masses of the white people. You get the white men ticked off, and it worked.
So Manley became an example of what the type of man the white men needed to combat was. And so he became a target of the 1898 campaign. And he was had a bodyguard, and he had people with him at all times to protect him. His newspaper was being printed in a storefront in downtown. The store owner was fearful that his building would be damaged, so he asked Manley to leave. He had to move to another building on the outskirts of town. And so Manley became a part of the rhetoric of the Democratic Party's campaign of 1898. Well, the newspapers of 1898 didn't really subscribe to a truth in journalism mindset. And Josephus Daniels admitted later in life that if it was a good story and it sold papers, then he was going to print it. And if he found out later that it wasn't true, well, oh, well, I sold some papers. I don't necessarily have to rebut what I just printed. So he wanted to sell papers. He wanted to promote the Democratic Party agenda. And so every story that he published in the N&O was with an eye to that goal. And the other papers in the state that were pro-Democratic Party followed suit. And so an erroneous article would get printed in one paper and reprinted in another paper, and it just spread. So the Democratic Party used the newspapers. And to add to the level of the propaganda are those cartoons that you see in the News and Observer that are very overt in what they're trying to get across. You have to remember, not everybody is literate as they are now. And so somebody looking at a newspaper may not be able to read the whole paper, but if they saw that cartoon, then they would understand what the paper was about and subscribe to that point of view. For the other component in the speech making that was going on, we had people like Alfred Moore Waddell and Charles Brantley Aycock going around the state giving pro-white supremacy speeches and making Wilmington the focal point of the state campaign. Because if the Democratic Party couldn't take over control of Wilmington, then the rest of the state might not follow. So it was multiple levels of propaganda that were going on.
Propaganda is essential to any military campaign. Black people tend not to understand propaganda. And the reason why we tend not to understand propaganda is because the propaganda channels, the mediums, the conduits, the radio, the television, the newspaper, we tend to just treat as forms of entertainment. We don't see them as military strategy. When there's a movie depicting black people in a negative image, when there's caricatures in the newspaper making jokes about black people, we tend to just see it as political entertainment. We don't see it as laying the foundation before the storm. That's exactly what they did in Wilmington. You always seek to create a context that allows your military campaign to be acceptable. There's always context. You study Adolf Hitler in Nazi Germany. He had a propaganda campaign that lasted over a year before he began to physically oppress the Jews. He had to make sure that the national mindset had been conditioned to accept the extermination to come. In Wilmington, North Carolina, the same exact thing happened years before Nazi Germany. Through the magazines, through the radio, through word of mouth, through stage play, they created negative images of black people in the minds of white folk in case there were any liberals who would have been against what they were going to do. They were slowly able to reform their opinion by constantly repeating negative information about the target population. See, the one thing about the brain that we got to understand is the creature of repetition. Whoever has the most access to the brain rules the brain. It's all about volume, not quality. The more you tell people that a certain group of people are no good, the more you show images, the more you show sounds, song, poem, dance, projecting negative information about a people, sooner or later, the subconscious begins to get conditioned automatically, because you can't turn off the subconscious to what it sees and what it hears.
Sound and image, you cannot stop it except to stay away from it. So sound and image are critical to any propaganda campaign because they help lessen the defenses of anyone who may be against what you're trying to do. It's the same thing happening right now. There is a direct assault on the image of the black man and woman internationally. So when mass incarceration, homicide takes place, nobody cares what's happening to black folk because they've already been conditioned to believe that these people are better off dead anyway. So propaganda is the first stage of military warfare. Right now, we're being set up for another extermination campaign. It's going to be worse than what went on in Wilmington, Tulsa, Charleston, Rosewood. It's going to be worse. Whenever the propaganda gets worse, then you know the extermination is going to be that much worse because you see how far the exterminator had to go in order to condition the people to prepare them for the carnage to come.
By the elections of 1896, the Democrats were basically out of power. The fusionist coalition of the black Republicans and white populists held a majority of offices throughout the state, including at the legislature. We had a Republican governor. In New Hanover County, there were, of the 5 county commissioners, there were 2 Republicans and a populist and 2 Democrats. So the Democrats basically were out of power, and they had to figure out a way to regain power. And so that was what led to the creation of the White Government Union in 1897, was to win the elections of 1898, even if they had to cheat or use intimidation or threats, murder, armed rebellion, whatever it took. They were going to regain power in 1898, one way or another.
The election for 1898 wasn't for the management of the city of Wilmington or the county. So they wanted to have some resolution, since the Democratic Party had swept the ballot, so that the Democrats would also control the city and the county. They developed a series of resolutions called the White Declaration of Independence. And in the White Declaration of Independence, some of the demands placed on the African American community were that Alex Manly needed to leave the city. He needed to stop printing his paper. And many people wanted the Board of Aldermen and the mayor to resign. And Alfred Mar Waddell, our great speech maker, was made chairman of a committee of 25 men to make these resolutions happen from the White Declaration of Independence. They called together the Committee of Colored Citizens that they decided were leaders in the black community. They were civic leaders, business leaders, church leaders, and they were given these demands by Waddell and this committee of 25. And these Committee of Colored Citizens members eventually answered by saying, we don't really have the authority to make these things happen, but we will do all that we can in the interest of peace to encourage things to happen. And so that response of the Committee of Colored Citizens was to be delivered to Waddell by the next morning on the 10th. So the morning of the 10th comes, and Waddell is informed of the response of the Committee of Colored Citizens, but he chose not to share that information with the rest of the whites in the community. So Waddell went to the Wilmington Light Infantry Armory on the morning of the 10th to meet with other members of the white community to talk about the Committee of Colored Citizens and their response, or the lack thereof. And he met a crowd of people, and the crowd got larger and larger and larger. Folks had guns. Folks wanted some action. Wilmington had been very tense, and it was as if a breaking point. Something had to happen to release the tension. And so Waddell arranged the men that were in the area together in almost like skirmish lines, because he was, after all, a Confederate officer. He marched them up Market up to 7th, and they went down to the printing press building, knocked on the door. Manly had been warned ahead of time that he needed to get out of the city, which he did. No one answered. Oops. They broke in the door. Oh, wow, look at all this stuff. They walk around the building. Oops. They found some gas and some kerosene, and oops, somebody happened to light a match and the building caught. And they wouldn't allow the African American fire company to come in to put the fire out until the building was mostly consumed, but before it happened to catch other nearby houses on fire. So once the fire was put out, the building was destroyed, the printing press was destroyed, and the voice of the African American community through the black press was destroyed.
This is South 7th Street, 7th and Church. And as far as I could tell by doing research, this is where the Daily Record was located, Alexander Manley's newspaper. And it was right next to a very historic church, St. Luke. My understanding is that the mob came down 7th Street from Market Street, where the Wilmington Light Infantry is, which later became the Wilmington Library. And they came down, the mob came down this street, and the first thing they did was this, some people said it was accidental. They didn't mean to burn it down, but they actually burned this Daily Record building down. They watched it burn. There were several pictures of it. I mean, there was a photo taken of them actually standing around the burned building. This is where it happened. Manley's Daily Record was burned right here.
Manley owned the Republican newspaper in the city of Wilmington, and William H. Bernard, who was a former Confederate officer, owned the Democratic newspaper, the Star News, which is still in circulation today. William H. Bernard was also a member of the Wilmington Light Infantry, an officer, in fact. But I find it ironic that one of the first actions of the coup leaders was to burn out a colonel of the Wilmington Light Infantry's main opposition newspaper. I mean, they burned his building to the ground and ran him out of town. I don't think they had planned on running him out of town. Personally, I think he was on the hit list. They had planned on killing Manley, but he got away. So they burned the competition out. And then after that, it was just the Star News, and that's all that's basically still here today. There's some small publications, but nothing like the Star News.
So you're saying that, Alice Manley's newspaper, the Wilmington Daily Record, really was the main newspaper.
Yeah, it was the largest circulation newspaper in the county, and they got burned out to financially, benefit a colonel of the Wilmington Light Infantry. I mean, this really all boils down to power and money is really what it all boils down to. But they use the pretext of white supremacy to gain the power and thus the money. The Session Laws of 1895, the North Carolina legislature had passed a statute that enabled citizens to petition the Superior Court to appoint people to elected boards if there was a certain number of signatures on that petition. On November 10th, 1898, the makeup of the New Hanover County Commissioners was 2 Republicans, a populist, and 2 Democrats. And so the Republicans and populists had a majority over the 2 Democrats, and so therefore they couldn't call out the militia. So William Barry McCoy drew up a petition pursuant to the laws of 1895 and asking a Superior Court judge named Boykin to appoint 2 Democrats to the New Hanover County Commission. This now changed the makeup of the county commissioners from 2 Republicans and a populist and 2 Democrats to 2 Republicans, a populist, and 4 Democrats. The Democrats now had a majority on the county commissioners, and they could now call out the Wilmington Light Infantry. And this is what occurred. This petition was drawn up in William Barry McCoy's office at 109 Princess Street And if you follow the names and the addresses of where these people worked at in the order of the way this petition was signed, they went right around the corner from William Barry McCoy's office at 109 Princess Street and went to North Water Street and started collecting signatures. And I have researched these people, and I've researched their office addresses, and you can follow the mob as they were going around from North Water Street, down South Water Street, down Market Street, back to the courthouse, where they ended up with almost 300 people who had signed the petition. And then they went in front of the judge with the petition. The judge approved it. There's the approval right there. He appointed in the courtroom 2 Democrats to the county commissioners. The mob then marched around the corner to the Wilmington Light Infantry building, held a rally, and then passed out the guns and marched on Brooklyn and took over the government of New Hanover County in the city of Wilmington. That's when the shooting started.
In Wilmington, on the afternoon of the 10th, we had bullets flying through the city, and the mayor and the board of aldermen were escorted to City Hall and were met with about 200 armed men in City Hall. And the way the city charter was written was, if a member of the board of aldermen resigned, another member would be put in that person's place by a vote of the remaining board. And Alfred Moore Waddell met the board of aldermen at City Hall, and he had a list of who he wanted to be the next board of aldermen. And so one by one, the board of aldermen switched from a legally elected African-American white coalition of government to a completely Democratic Party managed system. And Alfred Moore Waddell was made mayor. And the reason we call it a coup d'etat and the reason we say it was successful is because Waddell and that Democratic Party managed group stayed in control until the March election, and then they were reelected, and Waddell stayed mayor. In other places where people think coup d'etats have happened, there have been temporary solutions, and they were overthrown. It was permanent in Wilmington. It's the only coup d'etat in the state of North Carolina and the nation that was successful.
You had armed bands of whites who were roaming the city and essentially indiscriminately killing black people. Among these was the father of William Rand Keenan, Buck Keenan, who I think was on the back of a cart with a prototype Gatling gun and doing the same thing that I just described. So it was really, effectively, it was a slaughter. There's a substantial controversy over how many people were actually killed. I believe that the state's official report on the Wilmington riot, which I think is actually a fairly well done report, says something to the effect that the maximum estimates are in the vicinity of about 60 folks who were killed. But if you read the report and go through it page by page and count up the number of individuals who are reported to have been killed in the pages of the report, I think you get a figure that's in excess of 100 people. I have no idea what the exact number is. The stories have it that some bodies were literally thrown into the Cape Fear River, but there was sort of almost a genocidal execution of black folks that was taking place in the city. And many people fled to the surrounding wooded areas and had to stay there until white tempers had subsided.
Reverend Kirk was a target of the white supremacy group. They wanted him. They wanted him bad. They wanted him dead. So bad to the point they thought he was actually doing a funeral here. And they were waiting, the white ministers were waiting outside the church with guns to kill him. Now, how in the world you gonna wait outside a church with guns to kill somebody and kill another minister? You supposed to be a minister. Make me wonder what type of religion that you really follow. It's not true Christianity. It's your version of white supremacy Christianity. And you're going to wait for the man. You don't think he's doing it. No regards for the dead. That's just the regards they have for African-American people. But he stood, Reverend Kirk preached in his very pulpit to these very pews. And they waited outside his very church to kill him. But he escaped for his life. And his wife had to run into the cemeteries. And it was a very horrific event. And I'm glad that he was able to write about it. Because had he not written about it, that would have been another phase in history lost.
When the first black was killed, black male, the women and the children fled from Fort Fenner Hornet and ran over here to this cemetery. And there's also another cemetery on the other side of this one, but that cemetery is quote unquote white. This is a colored cemetery. And I'm surprised because we used to come out here and everything was growing up high, but it looks like they're taking better care of it than they used to. But they ran to this cemetery, and this used to be swamp area. From my understanding, this was swamp area, and they would hide. They were hiding inside the swamp, inside the cemetery, because I guess they figured nobody would come in the cemetery to look for them, because with this phobia about dead people. So this is where they came, and they stayed here for weeks, not just a day or so, but they stayed there for weeks. At night. If some of them will come out at night, a very few of them will come out at night to go get some food, and they actually had people begging them food at night. So this is where they went. This is a cemetery where, and if you read any documents about it, they were actually singing, "When the battle over, when the battle over, when we cross over to Jerusalem." That's what they were singing. They could hear these Negro women and these children all night long singing the song, "When the battle over, when we cross over to Jerusalem." They didn't know what to make of the whole thing. It was a total shock and bewilderment because it was unexpected. As most massacres and most violent occurrences are, they didn't know what was going on. They didn't think they had done anything wrong. And you have to understand, the people who ran out here were the yeomans, were the working class people. They were not influential blacks. The influential blacks were put on the trains and sent out of town. And this is where they came. And this is, I guess, being here represented peace then. It's a very peaceful situation. This is the colored cemetery.
After the violence in Wilmington, the black population vanished a lot. I mean, during the riot, people fled the city, and many people did not return. They hid in the swamps, came under cover of darkness, got their belongings, and left, particularly for people who were day laborers, who were renters of their homes. They left. And slowly, a new population of African-American laborers came into the city. Even though they knew they were moving to a city where they were second-class citizens and their wages were lower, it was still better than being a tenant farmer out in the countryside. Then the other part of the African-American community in Wilmington was the upper-class, more elite African-Americans who owned property in the city. They returned to their homes. Many of them had been protected prior to the violence by concerned white citizens. They also had a ceiling of an ability to move higher than they were financially or socially. Studying that generation, a lot of these upper-class African-American families had a father figure who was maybe in his 60s, 70s, or 80s at the time of the violence. And when that man died, his family, a lot of them left the city after that anchor to the city's history died. And so then we see people moving to Durham and other parts of the South and other parts of the country. Even as late as the 19-teens, we see that generation moving away from Wilmington. So economic prosperity was stunted for the African-American community throughout Wilmington.
It appears from the records I've seen that the population was evenly split 50-50 or slight majority African-American. And yet 2 years later, the population of the African American community had been cut in half, basically. So if the population in the area at the time was, say, 25,000 in 1898, and half of it was African American, then they killed and exiled probably 6,000 people in 1898 in order to cut the black population down to 25%. I know a lot of people were exiled, but I know that there were a lot more than 12 people killed during the coup. I heard a red shirt militia member when I was 8 years old brag about them carrying cartloads of, his word, niggers down to the river and throwing their bodies in the river. So, you know, cartloads.
Todd Hamilton and I did a study as a contribution to the Wilmington Riot Commission's investigation, where we measured something that we refer to as an occupational status score. And we tried to estimate that for workers in Wilmington prior to the riot and after. And so we compared, once again, 1897 with 1900. And so prior to the riot, the occupational status score for blacks was virtually twice as high as it was after the riots. So there was a substantial change in the occupational distribution, heavy drift towards lower status jobs, and a growing absence of blacks in higher status jobs. So that's not to say that blacks had a similar profile of jobs to whites before the riot, but it became grossly dissimilar after the riots. We can compare the city directories for 1897 and 1900, and they list all the business enterprises in the city. They also indicate who the owners were of the enterprises, and they indicate the race of the owners. And so in 1897, we know that there were approximately 216 black entrepreneurs in Wilmington, while there were 789 whites. The riot takes place towards the end of 1898. And if we go through the 1900 city directory, we find that there are only 162 black entrepreneurs. So that's a decline of 25%, in contrast with a slight decline among whites of about 2% in terms of their numbers of entrepreneurs in the city. And so the ratio of white to black businesses goes up from 3.6 to 4.8. And the preferred sites for business locations in the city apparently are in the Front Street and Market Street areas. And the numbers of black businesses on the Front Street and Market Street areas decline dramatically. I think it goes something like from 18 black businesses down to 3 or 4. If you look at the city directories. So the city directories give us a lot of information about the impact of the riot, particularly on black business operations in the city of Wilmington.
This is the man who led the coup d'etat on behalf of the Supreme Court of North Carolina and the Executive Committee of the Democratic Party of North Carolina. That's him. That's the face of a traitor. Pure evil. Now, in his records, I found a letter that was actually written to the postmaster of the city of Wilmington. Now, how this letter to the postmaster got into the possession of a murdering traitor, we can only surmise. But I'd like to read the letter to you. A letter from Jesse A. Bridges to Postmaster of Wilmington, dated January 3rd, 1909, from Walnut Springs, Texas. Postmaster, Wilmington, North Carolina. Dear sir, as my parents was from there, I thought I would jot a few lines to see if I can learn anything of my people. My mother's maiden name was Sarah LeGrand. She had a bro named John LeGrand, a lawyer. Also, some people by the name of Nash. I think John Nash, my father, was a doctor. A.B. Bridges, he had a bro named Fletcher Bridges. If you know of any of these folks, Will you please write me, as I would like to locate them? Please inquire of the said settlers, for which I will thank you very much. You will find a stamp enclosed for reply. Respectfully yours, Jesse A. Bridges. Now, the post office then sent this letter to William Barry McCoy. Now, the postmaster sent it to William Barry McCoy because everybody knew who was in charge of the coup, and everybody knew that William Barry McCoy knew where all the bones was buried. He knew who they had killed. He knew who they had exiled. Here's a man 9 years after the coup looking for a lawyer and a doctor. You know, where are they at? What happened to them? Lawyers and doctors don't just disappear off the face of the planet. I know what happened to them. They floated down the Cape Fear River.
The banishment campaign had as its purpose to eliminate any potential for organization of the Black community to retaliate against what was happening, either politically, legally, or physically. And so people like Thomas C. Miller and some of the preachers and some of the other civic folks were rounded up, arrested, and put in jail overnight on the night of the 10th. And on the morning of the 11th, they were told, get on this train, do not come back, or else you will be killed. Ari Bryant tried, and he almost didn't get back out of the city about a year later. So it was an effort to remove the ability of the Black community to come back together again and combat what was being done by the white supremacy movement.
I'd like to share with you a letter that was written by my great-grandfather. The letter is dated 7/9/1902. It's in the North Carolina State Archives in New Hanover County, and he wrote this to the Clerk of Superior Court. Colonel J.D. Taylor is who he addressed it to. And what he was doing, he had judgments on different doctors for monies that he had lent them. And at this point in his life, he was releasing these judgments. He was canceling these judgments. But I think in addition to that, he had a point that he wanted to get across. So he incorporated all of that into this letter. And I'm going to read you a little of what he was saying. What he said, he was saying that these doctors treated him as a human being, and that I shall continue to do, notwithstanding the way I have been treated, that for I have been treated not like human, but worse than a dog. And someday the Lord will punish them that punish me without cause. I am well, and I am doing well. The only thing that worries me is just that I was not allowed to come to my mother's funeral. She being 95 years old, the oldest citizen on Wrightsville Sound. Just to think of it will take me to my grave. If I were guilty of any crime or I was a criminal, it would not worry me in the least. But oh my God, just to think, it is enough to run a sane man insane. He says at this time that just to think how my own people could treat me as they have without a cause. Oh my God. Colonel, please cancel the judgments against Dr. Mass and Reynolds. I remain your heartbroken servant as usual, T.C. Miller. It's just kind of upsetting to hear that someone can't go to their parents' funeral. It wasn't allowed. They just put you out of a city and you can't come back. You lose everything you've worked for. It's just really sad. But even reading this letter, I know he was a man of faith because he mentions God quite often in this.
Let me find this one guy I want to point out. Let me find him because he's on here. Column 2. On the petition, one of the signatures was William H. Bernard. He was the proprietor and founder of the Wilmington Star-News newspaper. This is McCathern. This is McCathern Produce in downtown Wilmington. Murkison. This is the Murkison brothers. They were the bankers in downtown Wilmington. Let's see. Marsden Bellamy. He was an attorney and a Wilmington city attorney. This guy here, H. McLean Green, was the chairman of the executive committee of the White Government Union for New Hanover County. And William Barry McCoy was the state chairman. There's another McCathern. There's another McCathern. There's a Covington. Like I said, these are some of the names of some of the most prominent families in Wilmington. William A. Keenan. Keenan Auditorium at UNCW is named after him. You know, so even to this day, we have, you know, monuments to basically traitors. You know, our public buildings are named after them. There's a fountain downtown Wilmington that's named after them. You know, these people were traitors. They pulled off a coup d'etat, and they got away with it.
Well, I'm not sure if the state or the federal government had sufficient time to stop what was going on, but they certainly could have intervened in some way or tried to intervene in some way to prosecute the perpetrators of the massacre. And that never has happened. They also could have intervened in some way to try to compensate the victims. And it's my understanding that to this day, there really has been no compensation provided to the victims or their descendants. Why didn't they? I think because of the fact that the white supremacy movement had staked out their position of authority. They had taken power. And I don't think that there was anybody at the state or at the federal level who had the courage to try to turn them back at that point.
After I discovered that there were attorneys and judges involved in this, I went looking at the county courthouse for records from 1898, and in the clerk's office on a bottom shelf, buried under all kinds of other books and everything, I found the magistrate's log from 1898. And I've spoken with the state archives, and they said they haven't been able to locate this book. And I found it, and it lists all the magistrates because, as I said before, in order to effectively pull off a coup d'etat where you're overthrowing the executive and legislative, you must have the judiciary. They had the judiciary. This is the list of magistrates. And in order to understand the power of a magistrate in 1898, you have to understand the structure of the court system of 1898. It's different than the court system that we have today. Today, we have magistrates court, then district court, then superior court, then the North Carolina Court of Appeals, then the North Carolina Supreme Court. Well, in 1898, we had the Magistrate Court, Superior Court, and the North Carolina Supreme Court. Magistrate Court held almost all trials. The Superior Court was the court of appeal from Magistrates Court, and then the North Carolina Supreme Court was the last court of appeal. So, the magistrates heard most criminal and civil matters. They were much like our district court judges of today or even superior court judges. And so back in 1898, magistrates were appointed either by the legislature, the governor, the clerk, or they were elected. If they were appointed, when the next election came up, they then had to stand for election. Well, when I found the magistrates book, this is a roster of when magistrates are appointed. Well, when they're appointed, the clerk goes along and they write in the name and the date of appointment and whose place they took and why that person was no longer there. Well, these books are not, so the book should be in order as to date of appointment. They weren't. The book is in alphabetical order. It was dated 1898. So what it shows me is that in 1898, someone with the same handwriting wrote up a brand new magistrate's law. And there was literally a couple of hundred magistrates in 1898. Now, why would we have a couple of hundred magistrates in 1898 in a town of 17,000 people? I mean, today we've got 3 resident Superior Court judges, 5 district court judges, and I think 8 magistrates. And we've got 250,000 people. Yet in 1898, they saw fit that they needed a couple of hundred for some reason. And it was because they were taking people's property and they were exiling people. The red shirt militias would go around, they'd take a magistrate with them, and the magistrate would tell them, well, if you don't leave, we're going to hang you from that tree right there. Choice is yours. Go to jail, go to the tree, or get out of town. And a lot of these magistrates either signed a petition or from 1898, or I found their names on membership lists of the White Government Union. I've also found several African-American magistrates that were replaced in 1898, and it says they resigned. So there were forced resignations of the black magistrates in 1898 who were then replaced by appointment of the clerk or allegedly elected by the election of 1898 as magistrates of New Hanover County. And this is how they took over the government, was because they took over the court. They had the blessing of the court system. If they've got the blessing of the court system, then this all falls on the state of North Carolina. All of it. It's over.
Well, segregation goes back to Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, which was a Supreme Court decision that sort of laid out the separate but equal clauses. And in North Carolina, we did not have any segregated bathrooms, drinking fountains, train cars, or any of that until after 1898. And in 1899, as soon as this new Democratic Party legislature comes into office in Raleigh, the first Jim Crow legislations are passed here in North Carolina that segregate the races on train cars. And then it's just a cascading effect throughout the early 20th century, separating everything you could think about, from entrances to bathrooms and water drinking fountains to, in Wilmington, there were separate Bibles for African Americans and whites to testify on in court. So segregation permeated everything after 1898 in North Carolina.
The function that it served is to maintain a relative position of dominance for whites, and to make it possible for whites to enjoy certain privileges and benefits. Some of these benefits are quite concrete. Greater likelihood of a safer outcome when you have an encounter with the police. The possibility of obtaining black property without facing any penalty. the possibility of actually taking somebody black's life without facing any penalty. The separation of schools so that as whites, your children can go to the schools that are better resourced and thereby have an advantage in terms of educational achievement. So there's a series of, very concrete benefits associated with relative position in comparison to blacks that were bestowed upon whites as a consequence of having this Jim Crow apparatus. And this, of course, can have long-term effects, particularly if we think about the transmission of wealth across generations. If you have an older generation that was denied access to wealth or whose wealth was taken away, then they cannot bestow it upon subsequent generations. And we now are beginning to recognize that wealth, more than income, is the critical indicator of your capacity to participate and participate securely in this society.
Here's one of the bogus mortgages that William Barry McCoy wrote when he sold one of the properties that didn't belong to them. This is one of the, says it's owned by one of the coup members, Mr. Cummings, and it's sold and through the Mechanics Home Association Bank. These are some of the records that can be found at the Latimer House in William Barry McCoy's papers. This is one of the bogus mortgages. The person it was sold to did not exist. In the papers of William Barry McCoy that are currently held at the Latimer House, the Lower Cape Fear Historical Society, I found hundreds and hundreds of deeds of property. And I also found that William Barry McCoy was on the board of one of the banks that was involved in this. That bank ended up mortgaging those properties time after time after time to people who I can't find. I mean, it appears these people didn't exist. So it appears what they were doing was they took the property of people who were murdered or exiled and mortgaged them time after time after time, looting their banks with bogus mortgages. And then when the banks collapsed in 1929, all the properties were auctioned off. So it appears they stole the properties and then used them to basically loot the banks that they were all board members of, is what it appears to be. I found stock reports in McCoy's papers dating 1898, 1900, 1905, 1910, stating that the bank was in great shape. They didn't have any outstanding loans, no bad debts, nothing whatsoever. Yet, then I'd go and I'd pull out these shucks of deeds, and there'd be foreclosure after foreclosure after foreclosure, and bad loan after bad loan after bad loan. So not only was there bad loans that they kept foreclosing on and refinancing it to non-existent people, on the other end of the spectrum, they were lying to their stockholders in order to inflate the value of the stock of the bank and to rip off their customers, basically. I mean, like I said, this was all about power and money. It really didn't have anything to do with race. They just used that as the catalyst to enrich themselves, both with power and money.
Well, explain the economic and generational wealth that was lost to the Manley family, to your family, because of this whole massacre of 1898.
Well, with him and his newspaper, we could be on the level with the descendants of Daniels and the Raleigh Observer. We could be in the same boat. His paper was growing. He had advertisers. It was a daily paper who knows where it would have gone? It's unlimited what could have happened with his paper.
How much do I feel is owed to my family? That is kind of hard to determine. However, I know at his death, at Thomas Miller's death, they valued his estate at roughly $15,000. That was a lot of money back in those times. So if you take that figure and just kind of figure if you invested it, the real estate value, the businesses, him being run out of the city, losing his property or them taking his property, I really couldn't even begin to tell you. I would think it would be in the millions probably. I really do, based on the deeds I've seen, the contributions he's made to the city, his jobs that he had. They were good paying jobs, in addition to him making or earning money on the side with his own businesses. So I think he would be valued at quite a bit this day and time.
Well, I tried to study what happened to those wealthier families of Wilmington and the African American community after 1898. And those groups with the older father figure, who was the one who had amassed the wealth that the family had, when he died, the wealth was distributed amongst a handful of children, many times 5 or 6 children. Dividing an estate up will dilute the wealth of that estate just by simple math. And then when those children, some of them wanted to leave the city completely, they may have sold property at a value that was less than what it was worth, or just to get rid of it and be done with everything and wash their hands of Wilmington. And then they move to a new city where they may not have any advantages in getting positions or jobs or even purchasing property. So that wealth starts to get diluted amongst that second and third generation into the 20th century. And the economic depression that was pressed onto African Americans made it worse.
Do you favor financial compensation or reparations for the descendants of Simpson himself?
I favor it if there were some formula to actually make it work, but it would take a army of lawyers to deal with a problem like this, and the law has never been on our side, except unless we have the force to generate change, and I don't know whether the forces are there to generate change in doing something like this. Reparations overall, if we think about not just Wilmington, but just reparations from slavery, probably if you could just find a way to have educational reparations, that any black child who wanted to go to college could go free with no strings attached, that would probably make a lot more sense than just giving people money to see what they'll do with it. And I got a good idea what would happen if you did that.
Well, explain it. What do you think would happen?
Well, the car companies wouldn't have to worry about, particularly if I use a stereotype, the Cadillac company would do very well.
I think if a person can prove that they are the descendant of the victims and that there was some property loss, that they should be compensated. And I think that that's what I've been trying to accomplish. What I've been trying to accomplish with my organization is called the International Organization for Compensation and Reparation for the Victims of the Wilmington Race Massacre of 1898. I've been seeking these people, and I found 2 of them, 2 descendants, Manley and Thomas C. Miller's descendants, and they want to be compensated.
When you talk about reparations, because the cost of the trauma was so extensive and unending, the payment that is to be received, your compensation, should also be excessive and unending. You see, what if black people never had to pay a property tax as a result of having their property taken? That's perpetual, forever. What if our children automatically had free access to the universities in the state? Forever. That's perpetual. What if we were given exclusive right to certain industries within the state? What if we were given exclusive control over certain lands within that city? That's perpetual. Be careful about money. Money runs out. And because we don't have a self-sustaining economic community, if they were to give the Black descendants of the victims of the Wilmington race riots a financial payout, white people know through economic science that $1 trillion will be back in their hands in 25 years. Why? Because you have no businesses of your own in which to spend it. So we have to be very, very strategic with our war for reparations, because if we're not careful, white people will give you the money in one hand and take it all back in the next, because you don't have independent institutions in which to sustain yourself.
We've had it. We've had it in Wilmington 2 times. Let me show you what happened. This is Wilmington. We had the North 4th Street District that was brought up. If you see where the park is at, that was the original spot for a grocery store. Where the park is at, where the 1898 Memorial right now, I remember sitting in meetings in Wilmington on North 4th Street when we had the North 4th Street Community Organization. And we were going to put a grocery store there. There used to be a big building back there in the back and was going to be a grocery store. It never got developed. The only thing we got out that deal was the North Side Clinic that still exists on that side of town. Now you look at Castle Street. We went to Castle Street and asked for compensation. We had the Castle Street Association that we all put in for. Matter of fact, most people don't know this town, we had a Black credit union in this town that we put in money. All of us put in money to get a Black credit union established. What happened to those adventures? Those adventures were put aside. Monies were brought in. No one knows to the day what happens to the money. And what do we have on Castle Street? We have a bunch of antique stores. North from Castle Street, from 4th all the way down to 13th Street, we have no development. Those projects that were supposed to be a part of 1898 were never developed.
I guess in your opinion, like, why weren't they actually developed?
Because we sold out. And I say we. That happens every time. It happened in 1898. We sold out once again. The powers that be comes and offer a few of us an opportunity to exceed, an opportunity to move into this office and move into that office. And what we end up doing to our people, we end up selling out.
Like, what are your thoughts on, I guess, what the future of the Black community in Wilmington, during this time, what, I guess, might have been for Black people if this event never happened?
It's probably one of the most prosperous cities in the world. It was a world city because of that port there. And they exchanged with other cultures. The Black kids that probably would have gone to Europe to school and enlightenment and encouragement. It was no end to what they could have done.
Wilmington was on this rise. I mean, economically and politically, the city of Wilmington was on a rise. Largest city in the state, and it could have continued in every direction had 1898 not stunted the growth of half of its population. Into the 20th century, you see other towns in North Carolina start to grow, where Wilmington is probably sidetracked on dealing with its internal social issues. Other places like Charlotte and Durham and Raleigh aren't, and they're starting to expand and grow. Now, the white businesses in Wilmington did begin to grow and prosper, but the African-American community did not. And when you don't have a balanced growth pattern, things can't prosper but so much.
You've got people that say, well, I didn't have anything to do with that. And it doesn't really matter. And it doesn't matter that we today didn't have anything to do with it. The fact is that it happened and the state was involved. The state needs to make restitution. I mean, that's all there is to it. I mean, it's, you can't right or wrong through this passage of time. I mean, it can't be done. I mean, they need to be compensated. And it was the state that did this. It was the state that failed to do anything about it. In fact, it was a state that then, instituted Jim Crow and enforced the will and intent of the people that pulled off this coup. So yes, they do owe the restitution. They are responsible.
What I look forward to, I call it the Joshua and Caleb syndrome. And Joshua and Caleb syndrome was when you had the 12 spies went out to the land and you had the elders die off. When the elders die off, Joshua and Caleb went and take over the land. Wilmington is a diamond in the rough. And so it's going to take a younger generation of people that's going to move in with a more universal approach to take over the land of Wilmington. And that's what's going to eventually going to see happen in Wilmington. Wilmington's going to rise back up.
They say the Cape Fear River was full of bloody black bodies that day, that black people couldn't find their way, that black men died from gunshots in their backs, that black women ran to the swamps across the tracks, that very smart and bold black men were put on the train and given a free ride out of town where they were told to remain. They say that the dead bodies were left in the streets. The foul smell was so strong that buzzards circled for weeks, that black babies cried and moaned for their fathers and a bite to eat, that black folks lost all their savings and were left helpless and beat. It had to be done, said the white people who started it. They loved their town until the blacks tried to change it. They took over the city to restore their heritage, they said. They were heroes to many who wanted uppity folks dead. Some folks still don't see anything wrong with what they did, or that any harm was done to the ones who ran and hid. Serious damage was done to the soul of the town. That's why folks want to turn it around. Now is the time to make up for the crime, to help our children learn from our mistake, to ensure that there will be no more 1898.
It's a massacre. It's a massacre. It's a massacre. Woke up to a nightmare, blood on the ground, rifle blast alarm, barks of bloodhounds, can't scream, I'm shook, shadow of the feet by the door. Just yesterday, I was at my uncle's store, my aunt fussing, cause I picked a scab on my sword. The sweat creeping out my pores, and my heart racing, I gotta get out the door. I hear the screams and the curses, began quoting Bible verses, pick my head out the kitchen window. Through the trees is a road. Across the road there's a river. The only black boy who can swim. Destiny meets fate. I just wanna escape. I'm going for it. Wait. I'm going for it. Wait.
Their descendants are open to that conversation. Why? Because that was a coup d'etat.
As I climb out the window, drop to the ground. What I thought was a puddle of water was blood on the ground. And I looked right, and I looked left, nothing in sight. I looked up and saw Mr. Jeff's wife, hanging from a tree in a pretty blue dress. Couldn't kill a spirit, but they had to hang her flesh. And I took off through the woods, never looking back. Tree limbs smacking my face, heart pounding like the sledgehammer of John Henry. Stomach on empty, I see the road ahead. But wait, I hear the horses near. I kneel down, I let them cross. Hear the screams of my town as they shoot them down. Blood everywhere, a massacre. Wilmington's on fire. Wilmington's on fire. Just wait. Just wait. Just wait. Blood and mud cover my feet, but I won't stop running until I'm free. Sprint across the road, the moonlight on the river. I see a few people huddled by the river. Looks like some women and children. As I approach, I see the blood stains on their clothes, and their bodies lay still on the ground. Finger to my lips, told them don't make a sound. I put the boy on my back, swam across the river, told him just wait. Cross, put a girl on my back, told her it's gonna be alright. I gotta get you to the other side. Well, just wait. I did it 20 more times so we could escape. Wilmington on fire, 1898. Now just wait. Now just wait.